All right, Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is going to be the chemistry of organic molecules. We will be covering all of the sections in this chapter. We'll be going over organic molecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. It was once thought that all of the molecules of a cell must contain a vital force that differentiated them from the molecules of non-living things. So because of this, chemistry was broken down into the divisions of organic, which would be the chemistry of living things, and inorganic, the chemistry of non-living things. But we no longer recognize this idea of vital force to differentiate the two molecules. If a molecule of water is found inside of a living human being, it's no different than the molecule of water found inside of the ocean. Just because the living human being is living and the ocean is non-living doesn't magically impart some sort of force on that molecule. But we don't really recognize this idea of vital force. However, we still sort of classify chemistry into one of two different categories. We still identify organic and inorganic materials, but now we define organic molecules as those molecules which contain both carbon and hydrogen. So if a molecule must contain both carbon and hydrogen, just throwing this out there as an example, is oxygen organic? No, the answer is no. Oxygen gas, the gas that you breathe, oxygen contains two atoms of oxygen bound together. Oxygen is not organic. It is considered an inorganic molecule. Carbon dioxide, literally one carbon, two oxygens. Is that organic? No, it is not organic because it does not contain a carbon and a hydrogen. It contains a carbon, but there's no hydrogen bound to it. What about water? Is water organic? Water is H2O. Two hydrogens, one oxygen. Is that organic? No, water is actually considered an inorganic chemical. It is not organic. There is no such thing as organic water, at least not by the chemical definition or the chemistry definition. Organic means that the molecule must contain both carbon and hydrogen. Water contains two hydrogens and an oxygen, but does not contain carbon, so therefore it is inorganic. Now, there are only 4 classes of organic molecules that exist in living organisms. Those are going to be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. But despite there only being 4 classes of biomolecules, the diversity of life is possible because of the diversity of these molecules, which exists in all of these categories. There is a huge range in carbohydrates, from their purposes to their structure to their ability to store energy. There's a huge range in the shape and structure and function of carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. And we're just going to get to touch on just a few of those here in this semester. So here I have a diagram that just kind of shows the different structures. We have our carbohydrates over here, our lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time going over each one of these categories. But before we get into each of these categories, we're going to start off by talking about the carbon atom. And the reason why we're talking about the carbon atom, because the carbon atom is going to be found in every single one of these categories. And there's so many fascinating, interesting things about the atom of carbon in particular that's going to allow for these differences. So despite the many structural and functional differences in those organic biomolecules, they do all share the common feature of being composed of primarily carbon. Or primarily carbon and hydrogen. Here we have a carbon bound to 4 hydrogens. And so what makes that carbon atom so essential in this class of organic molecules is the fact that, number one, carbon is relatively small. It only contains 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Compared to everything else on the periodic table, that's relatively small. But because it has 6 protons, it has how many electrons? 6. Very good. Because it has 6 electrons, it only has 2 energy shells. So 2 in the inner energy shell, 1, 2, and then 4 in the valence shell. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now here's the interesting thing. He only has 4 in his valence shell. How many does he want in his valence shell? If you answered 8, then you are correct, and you did pay attention in our last chapter when we talked about the structure of an atom. If you did not get that question, please go back and review valence shells and electron configuration. It's going to be very important on our future homework assignments and quizzes, so you want to make sure that you are very comfortable with the structure of an atom. All right, so we have 4 electrons in its valence shell. He wants 4 more. We need 8 to be completely happy. And the way he's going to do this is by sharing with hydrogen. So what he's going to do is he's going to go to a hydrogen atom and he'll say, hey, I will let you sometimes borrow one of my electrons if you let me sometimes borrow one of your electrons. That way you can have 2 electrons and I have 1 more electron to complete my valence shell. And he'll form that same bond with 3 other hydrogen atoms for a grand total of 4 covalent bonds. And each one of these cases, that pair of electrons is going to orbit around both the carbon and around the hydrogen. It's going to orbit around both of them, forming that bond. And in this way, both electrons are able to have a happy or a filled valence shell. So the carbon atom has a couple of unique characteristics. That number 1 is going to be those 4 electrons in the valence shell is going to equal 4 covalent bonds. Now the interesting thing about this carbon atom is, yes, it forms 4 covalent bonds, and it can form those 4 covalent bonds with hydrogen, but it can also form those 4 covalent bonds with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. What do you recognize about that list? We have seen this list before. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Where have we seen this list before? If you answered the very first slide of our previous chapter, chapter 2, you are correct again. These six atoms make up 95% of all living organisms, are composed of these 6 atoms. Everything that is alive has these 6 atoms, and carbon can form a covalent bond with each and every single one of those. That's why carbon is going to be the backbone. It is going to be the key ingredient, the glue that holds all of these biomolecules together. So the fantastic ability of carbon, to covalently bond to other carbon atoms is absolutely essential to the structure and therefore, once again, the function of biomolecules. And this is because the carbon-to-carbon bond, that covalent bond right here between one carbon and the next carbon, it's a very stable bond. And because it's so stable, it allows for very long chains of carbons to form. So we can have one carbon bond to another, bonded to another, bonded to another, bonded to another, and what we'll have coming off the sides will be our hydrogen atoms or other functional groups, which we'll talk about. So these carbon chains are going to be made up exclusively, or if these carbon chains are made up exclusively of carbon and hydrogen atoms, they are known as hydrocarbons. Octane, for example, is a hydrocarbon. Now, the beauty of these carbon covalent bonds is that it allows the carbon to covalently bond to form double bonds, triple bonds, or even complex ring structures. We can have one carbon bonded to another carbon through a single covalent bond, but that carbon could also form a double bond. If you remember, we talked about double covalent bonds in our previous chapter. We could also form triple covalent bonds. We could also have this carbon over here form a covalent bond with this carbon over here. It'll actually wrap around in a circle and form cyclooctane or cyclohexane. Cyclohexane, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, has 6 carbons in it. So cyclohexane is an example of a hydrocarbon ring structure. So yeah, carbon can it's like the backbone of all of these different molecules. It forms sort of the base chain. So carbon is fantastic. It can bond to itself. It's a very, very stable bond. It allows for long carbon chains to form, and chains that are made up of exclusively hydrogen and carbon are going to be called hydrocarbons. Now, the carbon chain of an organic molecule is typically going to be called its skeleton or its backbone. That's when we have a really long chain of carbons all strung together. Now, the diversity of organic molecules comes from the branching structures or the functional groups that might be attached to this long carbon chain. In the same way that you have a spine or a backbone, but you have a head and you've got arms and legs attached to your backbone. Carbon chains, or a lot of organic molecules, will function the same way, where they'll have a carbon backbone and then they'll have groups that actually attach to and branch off that carbon backbone. The majority of chemical reactivity and polarity can be attributed to the branching groups or the branching structures that come off. These are what are known as functional groups. The reason that we call these structures functional groups is because their particular structure will change the function of a particular group. So here is a table right over here in the corner, a table of the more common functional groups and their significance. What you'll see here is this R highlighted in blue. That R is just a shorthand for remainder. It just indicates the rest of the chain. So if we have this little hydroxyl group right here, you'll see R bonded to OH. What that means is that OH could be bound to the R chain or the carbon backbone at any place. So right here we could get rid of that hydrogen and replace it with an OH group, and then the R would signify the rest of this chain. Or we could take that OH group and stick it on right here, and that R would stand for the remainder of the chain going this way. In the case of a carbonyl or a ketone that we see right here, we have an R on either side. In that case, it would be, and the R would be the chain going this way and the chain going that way, and we'd have a double bonded O right here in the middle. So that's a ketone, like an acetone. So the fascinating thing about these functional groups is that these clusters of atoms, these functional groups, are always going to react in a specific way. So we can predict the functionality of the carbon chain if we know what functional groups are attached. And this is going to determine the chemical reactivity of the molecule as a whole. And so we're going to talk about a few examples of this. We're going to bring this up, but I just want to point out that this table right here of functional groups, table 3.1, this is not something you need to memorize. This is not something I'm going to ask you to recall for a test. This is, however, something that you are going to want to be very familiar with if you go on to take a chemistry course, or specifically if you take an organic chemistry course. In organic chemistry course, in organic chemistry, everything comes back to functional groups. Over and over and over again. In that case, you may want to memorize this table or refer back to it later. For our purposes, I just want you to know what functional groups are. I want you to know what they do and sort of the significance of them as a whole. But I'm not going to ask you to memorize that, a carbonyl group is polar and present in sugars. An amino group is going to be polar, basic, forms hydrogen bonds, and present in amino acids. All of that information is going to be very useful. We're going to come back to it throughout this semester, but it's not something you're ever going to need to recall for an assignment. But I just want to kind of explain the functionality or the significance of these functional groups. So here is an example of a molecule. What we have right here is a molecule called ethane. Ethane is going to be a hydrophobic hydrocarbon. We call it a hydrocarbon because there's only hydrogens and carbons found in this molecule. But take a quick moment and see if you can tell me, what does hydrophobic mean? Hydrophobic means water-fearing. That's literally what that term means. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning to fear, water-fearing. It means that it is not soluble in water. Ethane and water do not mix. But if we add an OH group, we find that we form what is known as ethanol, and ethanol is hydrophilic. Does anybody know what hydrophilic means? Yeah, hydrophilic means water-loving. Ethanol is soluble in water. All we did was add an OH group. Now, before we end this video and move on, I would like to just give you a moment to see if you can figure out, why does adding an OH group take this molecule from a hydrophobic molecule to a hydrophilic molecule? So that'll be the question that we answer in our next video. But see if you can figure it out before we get there. Why does adding the OH group suddenly make this molecule hydrophilic?